that turned into, oh, recording in progress. Okay, good. How it then became NCIA, kind of broadly speaking, what we did, and then issue themes and conclusions that are kind of my own, really, I suppose. And it'd be interesting to know whether you all agree with that or not. So in terms of early beginnings, let's see if I can, oh no, what's going on now? Why isn't that's supposed to be moving up? Ah, there it is. No, look.
Oh.
This is where it all started. This is a really cool picture of me in about 1972, standing in front of Blackfriars Settlement. And as far as I'm concerned, this is kind of where this whole thing started, because I got washed up in Blackfriars Settlement, you know, really just out of college, not really knowing what I wanted to do, except I knew that it had to be something around political activism. And I found myself in Blackfriars Settlement, which actually was a welfarist institution. Many of you know that settlements have been knocking around since the late 19th century, were sort of precursors of the welfare state and did a lot of pioneering things. But by the time the welfare state had been well established, many of them had kind of lost their way, but were okay. They were still located in the areas they started in, and they were providing essentially welfare services, social work, a lot of work with young people and kids, literacy work, and a whole plethora of different things, stuff to do with people with disability and so on. I was lucky enough to be washed up there at the time at which the director changed, and the directorship was taken by Jim Radford, who was a squatters leader. He was a founding member of Committee of 100. He was a radical person who was particularly interested in direct action. And I then spent 5 happy years with various other people, understanding what I think I then found out was a mistaken understanding about how voluntary organizations, voluntary and community organizations could be involved in political activism. And so the experience led me to understand that there could be a conjunction between services to people and for people, which were essentially around mediating, you know, disadvantage and difficulty and racism and discrimination and such like, and blend that with not only providing a service that would help individuals or families, but would actually take the issues out into the community and campaign about them. And so I ended up with this model in my head, which was that charities, voluntary organizations, citizens' action, you know, needs to be properly responsible, needs not just to provide services to individuals and families, but also has a duty and a responsibility to take up the policy and political issues that arise from that. I won't go on about what I went on to do after that, but it was on the same theme, really, and then went freelance from there, and then spent many years wandering around voluntary and community action as a freelancer. And it meant going in and out of an awful lot of different organizations, large ones, small ones, national ones, certain amount of work with government and such like. And then the change came around 2005. Let's see if, no, well, I think I can skip this. I mean, you all know, I've looked at who's coming into this discussion this evening, and I know that you don't need to be told what civil society and citizens' action is about, but so we can move on from that, except to say that you know, NCI from the beginning was always about dissent and opposition. And the reason for that was because when Penny and I first sat down and started talking about it, we you know, and independence came into the equation. We realized that actually the importance of independence really only is tested when you're disagreeing with the you know, the third parties that you want to influence. And so the role of opposition and dissent is absolutely fundamental. The ability to, and the recognition of the ability to oppose things, be involved in dissent and protest, however you want to do that, is completely essential to the principle of democratic citizen action. And that Penny and I, when we sat down, what we were alarmed about was that independence was being eroded within the sector, but within civil society generally, and that one of the corollaries, one of the implications of that was that it was becoming much more difficult for organisations to stand up and be counted. So opposition and dissent has been in there from the beginning. What first happened is that Penny and I sat down in her front room and we had a chat, and we made a list of what we did, what we like and what we don't like, what we don't like and what we want. And this is the original. I think this is from 2000 and about May 2006, something like that. And you can see, I mean, I won't go through all that, but you can sort of see that this is a very familiar, for those of you who are involved in NCIA, this is a very familiar agenda. It's about bottom-up change. It's about the ability to protest and oppose things. It's about non-hierarchical ways of involving people. It's about not following a managerialist strategy. It's absolutely about opposing learned helplessness, which is very, very commonly found, not just in the voluntary sector, but elsewhere, and a number of things that we want. So that was the first thing. And then we thought, well, we need to partner this. We need, you know, two people who are not going to do anything by themselves. And this is one point where I want to pay some tribute to Colin Rochester, who sadly is no longer with us, because he was the first person that we phoned up and said, Colin, we've got this idea about doing something. Are you up for it? And I mean, you know, straight away he said, yeah, I'm up for it. And Colin remained involved and a very important member of NCIA right through to the time at which we closed it down. So I just want to pay tribute to that. The idea that the organisation we headed for was NEF, New Economics Foundation, because we had a contact there. And we started what we thought was going to be a nice love affair with NEF, in which they were saying, yeah, we're up for this, you know, definitely we're happy to put resources in. They made meeting room available to us, and they wanted to be effectively a kind of partner in the whole enterprise. Well, sadly, we fell out with them before very long. And I seem to remember that was one of the reasons for that was because it came to our knowledge that they had accepted a government contract to work in Camden to identify effective commissioning and contracting structures to deal with the voluntary sector in Camden. So, I mean, at this point, we sort of said, I don't think you get it. You know, this is one of the things that we're not very interested in. In fact, we're interested in stopping. So the connection with NEF disappeared. Anyway, we went ahead, and the first sort of public thing was this thing, October 2006. And I think there were 19 of us that sat down and moaned at each other about our own personal experiences of the voluntary and community sector, particularly, and society in general, and the directions it was going in. And it was from that meeting, it was decided that we were going to try and do something. And so from the autumn of 2006 through to the first half of 2007, we did a lot of kind of, you know, recruiting, sorting organizational structures effectively. And what we came up with was the Coalition for Independent Action. And there's a structure in place. I'll talk to you all about the structure and such like if you want me to, but I don't think it's necessary. We eventually got set up as a community interest company. That served us very well. It also allowed us to take money, and a very, very significant development was that we discovered the Tudor Trust. And discovered through talking to the Tudor Trust that they were concerned about exactly the same issues that we were concerned about. And as a result, they started giving us dosh. And they then funded us for, well, right through to 2000 and from something like 2007 to 2015. And I totted it up. I think in total, they grant aided us 320,000 quid, which is actually quite a lot, although spread over 7 or 8 years, it didn't buy a massive amount, but it was dead useful. And we couldn't have done what we were able to do without the financial support that we got from Tudor. So we were ready to go. It's the first newsletter. We were ready to go in March 2007. We pretty quickly discovered that we kind of bit. Oh, I was going to say we did an awful lot of this sort of thing at the beginning, so we're very familiar to most of you. We did quite a lot of this sort of thing, brainstorming about, what was the scope, where were we headed, what was our constituency, what would count as success, ways and means and such like. Did quite a lot of that and got through that, I'm glad to say, with some benefit. But then we ended up discovering that effectively we were biting off more than we could chew. Our interest was very, very wide. I mean, it's all listed there: community groups, campaign groups, local voluntary services, local second tier, national volunteer, policy wonks, local and central funders, the wider and political and social influences. So we were caught, and I think we never ever resolved this completely, but others may have a different view, between whether we were aiming to be a kind of mass movement or a think tank or a sort of research facility or something that was a demonstration or development project or a social media or other news agency. And given the slender resources that we were in control of, I think it is fair to say that we did bite off more than we can chew, and that we suffered the impact of what we were doing suffered as a result. But having said that, I mean, I think our aspiration was fairly clear, which was revolution and resistance, because we really, really didn't like what was happening to the world that the professional and social work that we inhabited. And so effectively we had two things that resonated with us. One was about supporting people who at the grassroots level on the front line were actually trying to make change. And the aspiration we set for ourselves, that for those people, we would try to support, encourage, and importantly, provide a safe place. We found out very quickly that a lot of the people that we saw as being within our constituency were actually quite frightened, particularly those who had paid work in the sector, were quite careful and nervous about saying to anybody around them they kind of agreed with where we were going and what we were going on about. There was many stories of a bullying management style, particularly in voluntary services agencies, which had already fallen foul of the kind of new managerialist agenda. So we thought it was important that we should commit some of our resources to try and provide a safe place for people who wanted to explore what they could or should be doing within their own setting. And then on the other hand, what I've called the collaborators, we decided that because everybody else was being so bloody sort of English polite about what was happening around them, they would privately, over a pint or a drink, would say, "You're absolutely right. Absolutely, things are going in the wrong direction." But the way that would come out in their public utterances was completely pathetic and unfocused and unlikely to persuade anything of anybody. So, and some of them were we absolutely did see as enemies, if you like. I mean, at a national level, both NCVO and Akivo behaved absolutely disgracefully, in our view, in relation to these issues. And so our aim there was to make trouble, name names, call them out, and make the damage visible. So we did try and do all that. What did we do, though? I mean, this is where it all starts to go. I don't know how to say this really, but there was this. We did think we did explore the kind of, the mass action route. And I think we completely failed at that. I mean, it was very, very difficult to reach in a meaningful way local groups at a local level. We toyed with the idea of having a kind of regional structure so that people could sign up to something that was closer to their domain and their geographical area, and that they could be pursuing the independence agenda and the oppositional agenda from that position. But were never really successful in doing it, and didn't have the resources to sort of spread around the country and make it happen. And in a way, what we then drifted into, and I mean, some people were cross about this, but I'm not sure there would have been an alternative, but we sort of drifted into, the kind of think tank research and promotion, profiling role of using media and such like to make the point. And I've listed here some of the things that we got up to, many of which involve working with other people, because we also thought we were very small. We needed to try and piggyback on the resources that other organisations had to offer. And so, you can list there are a number there. So we did some work. We did some work with Advice UK, the Advice National Representational Organisation. I mean, and that was another example of it absolutely fell apart, actually, to tell you the truth, because we went out and worked with local advice agencies in 3 areas, and only in one of those areas was there actually any kind of bottle to do anything that was about asserting the independence of their advice sector in their area. And advice agencies is one of those agencies absolutely has to be independent. You can't do advocacy with people if you're not independent. And then at national level, Advice UK also just sort of kind of walked away from the implications of the whole thing. It was much more, other collaborations are much more profitable. We did a collaboration with Open Democracy. Led's in the audience, I can see. He ran this project for us called Localism Watch, when localism was all the rage. Kind of pointing out that the localism agenda was actually largely a government fraud. We did some work with the TUC, organising a national conference. We did a lot of work with Boycott Workfare, which is about keeping volunteering voluntary, it was called, which was trying to support those who were opposing workfare, the government workfare proposition. And so there were quite, I mean, there is a mass of information. I mean, I put down there the website. I've kept the website going all these years just because I can't bear to see it disappear. But it's all there. I mean, everything, all the reports, all the research documents, local case studies, all the newsletters, which I have to say I really enjoyed doing because that's my big opportunity to call people out. They're all there, and I don't know what to do with them. At some point, we're going to have to shut it down. Although the archive, I should say this, is the archive. We gave the archive to the Bishopsgate Institute and also found out by accident that our stuff was being monitored and kept by the National Library. I mean, they obviously had some sort of quirky interest in outliers, as they would call them, I suppose. Anyway, there is apparently supposed to be a full website screenshot of NCI at the National Library. I've never tracked it down, but it's supposed to be there. Anyway, this stuff is all there. So this is the kind of stuff we got into. There were projects, research, campaign literature, media work, open letters, the newsletters. We did loads of workshops, loads of conferences around the country, many of which some of you were involved with. And then we were largely vilified by the voluntary sector establishment, who didn't like us, but we didn't like them. But actually, I think, I mean, I'm now getting to what I think the problem, if you like, with the thing, which is that we were running a campaign, but it was very difficult to design a campaign manifesto. I mean, a campaign manifesto would say things like, stop oil, don't do that, do this instead. And what we always found ourselves saying to people was very much more nuanced than that. It's very, getting a local organization to grab the question of independence and, if necessary, opposition, dissent, by the scruff of the neck, takes a lot of sort of internal meanderings, assessments, risk assessments, juggling, the needs of staff with the needs of users, the implications of funding cuts, all of these things become very nuanced. And as an example, the next slide I'm going to show is that one of the things I put in the newsletter at the beginning of 2009, where I call it 10 suggestions for action, what might make a difference? Well, actually, if you just have a look at some of these, oh, wait a minute, that's not the right one. Where's it gone? Oh, where's it gone? Oh, there you go. There's that. I mean, it's a bit wanky, really, just to sort of say, argue for what you want, be willing to say no, repeat to yourself until you breathe it. The voluntary community sector is different to the statutory and private sector. Don't allow yourself to be isolated, frightened, and exposed. Now, these are not exactly campaign slogans, but actually that is what we wanted people to do, and mostly they found it very difficult. And if I was in their position, I would have found it very difficult as well. So that's one of the problems, was that how do we construct a non-nuanced manifesto agenda? Role confusion at the top, I've talked about that. I mean, many times we didn't really know whether we were coming or going in terms of, where to put the resources, how to prioritize what we ought to be doing or not. And what was happening around us was the blatant fragmentation of voluntary and community action, at a local level especially. I mean, particularly in terms of the voluntary services sector, the professionalized sector, the arrival of contracting and commissioning, by its very nature, put organizations in competition with one another. And that we found that networks were evaporating, people's ability to learn from each other, to work together, were becoming more and more difficult to do. And to be truthful about it, they were getting very little encouragement and support from the local second-tier infrastructure, the community councils for voluntary service and such like, who themselves have become co-opted by effectively the government agenda. And that led into the absolute depth of co-option, compliance and complicity, both at local level and at national level, driven particularly by funding, by contracting and commissioning. And in this, we then, we encountered both the power of the establishment, both the government establishment and the sector's own establishment, the benighted NCVO chief executives and Akivo and such like, and the obvious power of funding. I mean, what were we supposed to do about that? I mean, organizations which depended on funding were going to find it very difficult to bite the hand that fed it. And many of them decided not to. And another thing that occurred to me, and I have to say, I never really acknowledged this until I came to think about this, but we were active from 2007 to 2016. And between 2007, 2010, we had a Labour government. And the task that we were taking on in relation to the Labour government was that there was loads of money around for voluntary services particularly. And the argument we are putting forward was that all this funding has strings attached to it, and that's where the challenge to independence came, and the challenge to disagree with the funders because they were offering the funding, and that then in 2010 that absolutely reversed, because when the coalition government came in, we then entered into the decade of austerity, in which there was no money around. And what also happened was that the Tories, Labour started it, but the Tories were pursuing a very active process of privatisation of public services, and voluntary services particularly then got tied up with all of that. And so, in the latter days, we had the absolutely ludicrous situation of, if you take criminal justice, for example, of, voluntary sector agencies that dealt with offenders and ex-offenders, or recidivism generally, are finding themselves being subcontractors to Serco around offender programs. Well, I mean, you couldn't make it up, really, that sort of transition. So we found that the impact of austerity shifted the consciousness of our constituency, and then also had to shift our consciousness as well in terms of our work program and our priorities and how we presented the issues. And I mean, it is from that point that we became much, much more explicit about being opposed to privatisation. So overall, I mean, I think I said this in the blurb, that advertised this session, is that I don't apologise for what we all did at all. It was absolutely had to be done. But I think that our initiative was could not by any stretch of the imagination be called successful. What we did do is we in a way, we won the argument, because it became, by the time we got to the mid-2000s, it was acknowledged, even by the voluntary sector establishment, that the independence of voluntary services particularly was compromised. That most of them didn't see that as a problem. They actually saw partnership with government or with the private sector as a completely acceptable route for charities and voluntary service groups to take. We disagree with that, of course. There were many examples of local service agencies that did change their practice. And I mean, I discovered one not long ago, and I was talking to somebody who was running an agency in Cambridge, and I was bemoaning the fact that we never had any influence. And he said, well, you had influence over us, because he said, I'm telling you now that we stopped bidding for contracts because we'd read your stuff and agreed with it. So I thought, oh, that's nice. That's one agency anyway. Anyway, there were service agencies who changed their practice. And I mean, one thing I haven't said so far, but needs to be said, is that we did differentiate between community activists and community groups and voluntary services, professional paid on the whole, voluntary services agencies, and the national corporates. And community activists didn't really need to be told any of this. I mean, we did do one of the pieces of work that Penny did was a local inquiry into activism and dissent. And generally speaking, that she found that activism and dissent was alive and well amongst small community groups. What she also, discovered or revealed was that local community activists struggle more than they need to, and more than they probably used to, because they had lost their connections with those voluntary agencies that do have resources, second-tier agencies, but also agencies like, going back to Blackfriars Settlement. There used to be a closer symmetry between local community groups who were, banging their drum or arguing their case, and local professionalized voluntary agencies being involved with that, saying you can use our photocopier, or you can have meeting space with us. As the voluntary services sector moved away from all of that and into a tighter contract, evaluation-driven, managerially driven agenda, these links and networks very often fell away. What happened to the Voluntary Services Agency, or that business sector, was, is unbelievably well portrayed in the inquiry into the future of voluntary services, which we did, and which some of you were involved in writing papers for. 17 really, really good. I got them all out and started looking through them, and I thought, bloody hell, this is really good stuff. There were 17 of these reports completely ignored by the voluntary sector establishment, to the extent that I was so pissed off about nobody being interested in this that some of you will remember there was somebody called Caroline Slowcock, who was well tied up with the Commission on Independence, the NCVO were doing, which got absolutely nowhere at all. And I was so pissed off that they ignored the voluntary services inquiry that I photocopied all 17 reports and then put them in a parcel and posted the two and said, you haven't paid any attention to what we're saying so far, but I just thought I'd give you this little bomb, and I don't suppose you did even read them, but absolutely, that was a really big piece of work, which I think nailed the existing situation as far as voluntary services were concerned, and laid out our stall very eloquently. And the third category with the national corporates, well, like I've said, they were a lost cause anyway, to be honest. I think they'd already gone down. I mean, we know those national organizations where you walked into the glass door lobby and they easily could be a private sector corporate firm. And so there was very little to be done in relation to them, I think. I'm nearly finished now. I've put down, we certainly had some fun. I mean, one of the nicest things about being involved in NCI was all of the people I met and spent time with and worked with. And it was a complete pleasure to find, like-minded folk who kind of agreed with what we were doing and were willing to lend a shoulder to the wheel. So we did have some fun. One thing that before I move on to you lot, the one thing I want to is to broadcast, I think, is that Penny, one of the last things Penny did in February 2016 was that she said to our directors and planning group, she said, I just want to have a last chance to try and sort out in my head, where I think where I think we ought to be concluding this long 10-year piece of work. And she called it Thinking Out Loud, the job of voluntary services. So it did focus on the voluntary service sector and the fact that we'd had all these problems about trying to sort out what's the nuanced, appropriate role for them. And she came up with something which I think is really powerful. And she's, I'll read it. It says, voluntary services are part of a wider realm of voluntary associated citizen action. Such action, it forms a critical part of our democracy. And she outlined these 3 democratic jobs, as she put it, to provide an ungoverned or own governed space where people can just do what they like. They can be free to do what they like outside of state control and the pressure of markets, to do what they wanted. Conviviality, which is a lovely word I got from Colin, conviviality, which is just people coming together to have fun and get on with each other and support each other socially. But whether it's around leisure, social solidarity, assistance, personal social change, the first is that we have to safeguard the democratic right for us to do that. The second is to act as a check and balance to the state and other powerful interests, which is, takes us back to the responsibility of people who are concerned about whatever it is, whether it's disability or homelessness or the benefit system or whatever it is. That if you're involved in those issues and you know something about it, you have an absolutely a democratic duty to generalize your experience and go after those who aren't providing what is needed, both in the private sector and state sector. And the third was the traditional job, as it were, or the historic job of voluntary services, voluntary action services, which was, acting as a helper to the state in terms of spotting gaps in community needs, testing out new ways of doing them, and ensuring that these are known about and the word of them is spread more widely, and that follows through into appropriate state responsibility for its citizens. Now, I think that pretty well sums it up, really. That's what we were after. That's what I'm still after. I'm now 10 years older, or something like, and a great deal more cynical than I was before, because my own view is that things are much worse rather than much better than they were in 2016. But that's the point at which I want to stop and ask you lot what you think about how things are in 2024. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, if I can get my